Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon we're going to look at homosexuality, same-sex relationships, and the New Testament. There are 6 passages in the Bible that are known as clubber passages. Really, they're bullets that people fire against the LGBT community to say you're wrong, and any expression of your sexuality is illegitimate, because the Bible, these 6 clubber passages, clearly outlaw them. We're going to look at the New Testament this afternoon, and we're going to look at the 3 passages that are known as clubber passages that are in the New Testament. Romans chapter 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, or some verses in there, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, a few verses from there. We're also going to look at a little passage, a story about Jesus in Matthew's Gospel chapter 19, which sometimes gets dragged in to this whole affair. Anyway, the point is simply this. The point I want to make is this: that biblical studies, in as far as they've been used in a weaponized way to destroy LGBT people and their lives and their credibility and their sense of peace, in as far as New Testament verses or Old Testament verses have been used in that way, not only are they wrong, but actually they lag a long way far behind true biblical understanding and studies. And that's the problem. In evangelical circles, there's been a lack of intellectualism that has meant that we've not dealt with these biblical passages as we should. And in other sections of the church, there's been a failure to deal with the Bible at all, I think, in some circumstances, in some cases. Biblical scholarship, or some biblical scholarship, I should say, only some biblical scholarship, has not kept up with the wider world of scholarship. It's not kept up with archaeological discovery, what we're learning about civilization through the ages. It's not kept up with wider cultural research and understanding. It's set itself on one side, and all I can say is it's been driven sometimes by prejudice or perhaps fear to stand up and say what's truly believed, than by any true understanding or grappling with the New Testament or Old Testament passages. Before we start, I'm going to issue this warning. It's a parental advisory explicit content warning. And the reason for that is because we're actually going to delve into the context and the culture into which Paul was writing. The 3 clubber passages in the New Testament are all written by Paul or one of his followers. And in order to understand Paul, we've got to understand the context into which he was writing. Now, it so happens that something extraordinary happened on this day, August the 24th, 79 AD. What happened on that day gave us the ability to see back into Roman culture and understand the world into which the New Testament was written. It was on that day in history that Vesuvius exploded in Italy, and Herculaneum and its sister city, Pompeii, were destroyed. Or rather, they weren't destroyed, they were buried in ash. Instantly, life was not frozen, it was the opposite of frozen, but life in Pompeii and Herculaneum came to a standstill, and those cities were buried. And they lay under layers and layers and layers of dust and ash for the next 1,500 years or so. In fact, people even forgot that they were there. Pompeii was a significant Roman city. Herculaneum was a significant town. But through the 16 and 1700s, beginning in the 16 and 1700s and stretching into the 18 and 1900s, and now still into the 21st century, slowly we are reclaiming both of those towns. And as we do so, we find this. There are hundreds of people just like this. They were frozen in that moment. You can even see the clothes that people were wearing when life suddenly came to a standstill in Pompeii. You can even see the expressions on their faces. Not just people, animals. If you ever get a chance to go see Pompeii in southwest Italy, it's really worth the visit. Just to see the very people that were involved in life. Now, when Paul wrote, he never wrote a letter to Pompeii. He did write to a number of other Roman colonies or cities, and he wrote to the Romans, to the capital city of the empire. Paul is writing to Rome and to Roman Christians and to Christians in Roman cities because he has something to say about the relationship of this new revolutionary movement he's part of, the church, to the seat of power and to the Roman emperor. The Roman emperors, they constantly tell the people, trust us, pay your taxes and we'll protect you. It was called the Pax Romana. You pay your taxes and we'll keep you secure. And in Paul's day, that's exactly what the emperors said. Claudius, and then after Claudius came Nero. And that's the time that Paul is writing in. These men claimed to be God. They claimed divine power. And they said, follow us and we'll keep you safe. But Paul is writing anti-Caesar rhetoric, letters. He's saying Caesar is not Lord, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Christ. Follow Christ. He brings a better kind of peace and a better kind of inclusion for everyone. That's exactly what Paul's writing is about. It's exactly what his writing to the Romans is about. He's writing to change Judaism. He is a Jew. He's writing to reform Judaism to include everyone because Christ includes everyone. And he's writing against the Caesar to say follow Christ, not Caesar. Pax Christos, not Pax Romana. In Rome, not everyone was protected. The high classes were protected, Roman citizens were protected. But in Rome, there were all sorts of people, slaves, refugees, gladiators, prostitutes, people at the bottom of the pile who had no protection whatsoever. They were known as the infamer. We keep that word infamous. It means without fame. It means without recognition. To be infamous is to be without. And the infamer were those people in Rome who had no legal status at all. No slave had any legal status. Paul is writing into these cities. But let me tell you a little bit more about Pompeii. As Pompeii was rediscovered, and Herculaneum with it, we began to discover their artwork. And we began to discover this. Their artwork is sexually explicit. Here are some pieces of art from Pompeii. A penis in a temple. And here's a penis on a pathway. It's erect. And here's a penis on another pathway. It too is erect. It's stiff. Here's another penis on a wall. Here's a further one on another wall. Is there any end to this? Here's another penis. Endless penises in this culture, in Pompeii, in Herculaneum. Most of this artwork, not just erect penises, but the artwork that decorated the buildings in Pompeii, were taken away to this place. This is the Naples National Archaeological Museum. The artwork was kept there. There's a famous story about King Francis I of Naples, who in 1819 made a visit to the museum because word was spreading around Italy of everything that was being discovered in Pompeii. So he, with his wife and his teenage daughter, made a visit to this museum. And when he saw all that was on display, he was so outraged and so concerned for the youth of Italy that he had the hall where all of this was contained bricked up. And it stayed bricked up with a short interval until the year 2000. It was only in 2000 that one whole end of this museum was finally opened up to the public. And still today, you can only go in it if you're under the age of 14, as long as you're accompanied by a mature, responsible adult. That's how scared everyone was of people seeing what was contained inside. Because inside, there were lots more penises. The Roman people loved the penis. They loved the stiff, erect penis. The penis, for Roman culture, was a symbol of power and pleasure. There's much written about this. In actual fact, I'm sure in your past, back in school, when you were doing Roman history, you learned about the debauchery of Rome. And we hear about all of that kind of stuff, but then we park all that when we come to reading the New Testament. It's like, oh, well, that was history and this is the New Testament. But actually, the New Testament was written into this history. 80% of the artwork on the walls of the houses in Pompeii and Herculaneum was explicit. Here's another shot. Here's another shot. A threesome. And it goes on and on and on. In Rome, sex was everything. Sex was had between men and women and women and women and women and men. In Rome, sex was an important part of life. If you were a middle-class man, you were expected almost to have sexual playthings aside from your wife. Your wife was to pass on the family line. Your wife was to produce legitimate children to keep the household going. But you'd have a mistress, a concubine. You'd have a boy that you had sex with as well. And all of that was respected. It wasn't frowned upon. It was normal and natural and written about. But what you weren't allowed to do in any circumstances is have sex with another Roman. Roman citizens were protected. You could only have sex with an infamer, with someone of lesser status, with a slave, with a gladiator. And so Roman society was two-tier. There were those who had power and could have pleasure, and those that were constantly put down. Roman boys were given, as they reached puberty, a bulla. A bulla was a necklace they wore. And inside the necklace there was a little clasp, and inside the clasp there was an erect penis. And the bulla, the necklace, and the little erect penis inside the clasp was to protect them from other Roman men. And when they reached the age of 13, the age at which they could marry, not only were they given a toga, but the bulla was taken away because now they were on their own. They had reached sexual maturity. But Roman boys were protected in a way that slave boys weren't. For a Roman man, sex was a legitimate part of life. But you had to have sex with an inferior and you had to penetrate them. You weren't allowed to be penetrated. And all of this was tied up with their worship. We always tie up what we want to do with our gods. Here is the god Pan. This is a statue taken from Herculaneum. And there is the god Pan penetrating a goat. Pan was a god who was worshipped across Roman cities. You become like your gods. M.L. Durkheim, a famous sociologist, did lots of work around this, and he said, he made clear that what we do is we invent a god in our image, and then we worship that god because that god legitimizes the way that we want to live. So our god becomes our motto, if you like. Our god becomes our little hero, and we imbibe into that god everything we believe in, and then we worship that god, then we feel better. So we invent a god who's fine with consumerism. We invent a god who's fine with everything we want to do. And through worshipping that god, we legitimize our lifestyle and our values. That's the work of Durkheim. And it's based on his study of religion through the ages. So here is this god, Pan. And Pan has sex with who he will. And that's why the Roman can as well. Here's a picture that I took. This is the temple to Pan. A few months ago, I went to Athens, and I stood on Mars Hill where Paul preached in Acts chapter 17. And as you look down Mars Hill, I stood right where Paul preached. And you look down Mars Hill, and there at the bottom of Mars Hill is this temple, a temple to the god Pan. This is the world into which Paul was speaking. This is the world in which he was working, where sex was everywhere and where those without right were exploited and used by the rich and the powerful. This is Pan's son. He's called Priapus, the son of Pan. This is a drawing, painting from a wall of a house in Pompeii. He has a rather large penis. The goal was to imitate the gods that you followed. Here's a picture of the Lupanara. No member of the public was allowed into the Lupanara until 2009 because it was so explicit. One of the artworks from the Lupanara is this. It's a sexual plaything because Roman women would have sex with one another. And Roman women would have sex with slaves, as well as Roman men engaging in all of this. Here is a Roman goddess, Cybele, known as the Great Mother. Cybele rose to power amongst the ranks of the gods in Rome. And here is her love interest, Attis. Attis was Cybele's son. Cybele had more than a mother love for her son. Cybele decided to make Attis, her son, her sexual partner. The problem is, this is Roman mythology, the problem is that Attis wanted to marry someone else. So at the wedding ceremony, when Attis was going to marry his bride, Cybele turns up. And what Cybele does is she puts a curse on Attis that drives him into a rage and makes him lose his mind and makes him castrate himself. Every year in Roman cities, slaves would be driven into a drunken stupor. Laurel leaves were used to bring on a druggy state, and alcohol was used. And then these slaves would be driven through the cities and forced to castrate themselves every March the 24th. Forced to castrate themselves. This is what happened in Pompeii. And then Roman high society women would have sex with these castrated men who kept their penis but lost their testicles. 2,000 years before any kind of contraception, this was a fantastic way of enjoying the pleasure of sex for a woman without the fear of pregnancy. This is the world into which Paul is writing. He's writing into a world where the rich live a life of pleasure and they use and abuse and exploit and put down others. Justin Martyr, one of the early church fathers, writes about all of this. This is what he says. He says, we see that almost all so exposed, not only the girls, but also the males, are brought up to prostitution. And anyone who uses such persons, besides the godless and infamous and impure intercourse, may possibly be having intercourse with his own child or relative or brother. And there are some who prostitute even their own children and wives, and some who are openly mutilated for the purpose of sexual abuse. And they refer these mysteries to the mother of gods, to Cybele. So that's the situation in every Roman city. And what we see in Pompeii is just a faint image of what's going on in the cosmopolitan city of Rome. It's drenched in sex. And that's what Paul's writing to. So now we come to what Paul actually says. Romans chapter 1, verses 22 and 23. Although they claim to be wise, this is normally read as being an anti-gay polemic. Although they claim to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Every Roman god also had an animal that they could appear of as. Zeus could appear as an eagle. You will know that Roman gods and Greek gods often appeared as animals, and the animal would encapsulate some of their attributes. So Zeus was powerful and the eagle was the king of the birds. That's why Paul says they've given up worshipping the immortal God, the God of community, the God of love, the God who embraces all. And now they worship these animals that allow them to abuse and reject and put down other people, use them as sexual playthings. So let's go on. The next verse is, even their women have exchanged natural sexual relationships for unnatural ones. Everyone is abusing someone else in these cities. Debauchery is everywhere. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relationships with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty of their errors. So Paul goes on. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Can you see how that's a perfect description of what we've just seen? It's a perfect description of a society where power and pleasure belong to the elite and they use and abuse others and put them down. The New Testament has nothing to say about same-sex relationships. None of this is about relationship at all. It's about the use and abuse of another person for an act of pleasure for the moment. And it was rife, as you've seen from the artwork and the pictures that we now have from Pompeii. That's why I tell you that some biblical scholarship just hasn't kept up. When I was at theological college, I read a book called The Crucified God by a scholar called Mortman. And I was told that Mortman, well, this is liberal stuff, you really shouldn't be reading this. 45 years on, he was asked to speak at HTB at a leadership conference. What's the difference between being a liberal and a conservative? About 45 years. We move on and we grow, but there's always the kick and struggle of those who are more occupied, in my view, with their preconceptions and judgments than they are in exploring truth. This isn't about homosexuality. This is about the use and abuse of other people for your pleasure. And you'll see it doesn't mention the term homosexual at all in it. In actual fact, there's an older translation of these particular verses where it uses the word fornication with every kind of wickedness and fornication. It's what the King James Version says. Fornication's an interesting word because that's not about LGBT or T either. Fornication comes from the term fornix. Fornix in Greek means archway. In Rome, the prostitutes used to gather under the arches, and men used to go to the archways to use and abuse them. So, fornication came from going to the fornix. In some understanding nowadays, fornication is any sex outside marriage. You know, that's what, that's fornication. No, in the New Testament, it was about going and seeking out a prostitute and using and abusing her. Fornix, fornication, sex in the vaults or the archways. But even that, in the newer translations, has been excluded here because the scholars realised that it was something different. So that's Romans. Let's move on really quickly. Here's a really important word in the New Testament, although it only occurs twice. It's arsenokoitis. Arsenokoitis is used in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and 1 Timothy chapter 1. Arsenokoitis means man bed. Man bed. It's a term used by Paul that's never used before. No one else uses it. It occurs twice in these passages for the first time. The way we understand how a Greek word works is to compare it with all the other usages of that word. Say in Homer, you look at how it's used in the Iliad, or you look at what's going on in the Odyssey, and you say that Greek word means this. But this Greek word that Paul uses is never used anywhere. We have to conclude that he invented it, or if he didn't invent it, whoever used it first has lost. It is used in Greek after Paul, but every time it's used to follow Paul. So he uses this term, man bed. And this is the term that's been used for homosexual in these two passages. Here's 1 Timothy chapter 1. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, that's fornication, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders, for liars, and for perjurers. Here's the other use. In the NIV that I'm quoting for, the term homosexual isn't used in this translation, but I've identified where it normally says it. But do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, or idolaters, or adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And this is what you once were. Do you see that? So, I ask you about these two passages. What do you recognise about them? It strikes me that they are a list of people who exploit and abuse others. Those who kill their fathers and mothers, murderers, slave traders, liars, perjurers, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, slanderers, swindlers. Oh, and also homosexuals. How bizarre is that? These are two lists of exploitative people who abuse and use other people. It's clear from both of them. It's clear from the context. So, whatever this term, men bed, means, it has to be about exploitation. Perhaps it's about the men who control the beds of the prostitutes. The pimps who use them and abuse them and put the slaves down because they're cheap and they can be bought, they're things. Perhaps it's about the men who go and use the prostitutes and put them down and have no relationship with them. But what it's definitely not about, unless you want to work completely outside the context of any historical document that we have or outside the context of the two passages themselves, what it is not about is loving, kind, generous, faithful LGBT or T people who seek an ongoing, stable, monogamous relationship. To use it in that way is an abuse of the Bible, an abuse of the text, and in my view, just walking away from any kind of intellectual wrestling with the Bible itself. We have to think again. One last passage, and then we're finished. This is Jesus. Some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. They asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you heard, he replied, that in the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and he said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And that's used to imply that, there you go, Jesus taught that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's that. Actually, that's not what that passage is about. My problem with people who exclude LGBT people based on the Bible is it's simply an anti-intellectual way of approaching the Bible that masquerades as a kind of biblical conservatism, when in fact it's far from that. Let's look at the passages and look at the context and look at the culture as we've done in these other three passages. The clue actually is in the beginning. Some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And actually, in most Bibles, there's a little letter there, and you look down at the bottom, and it's a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. Check it out at home when you get there. And then you go look at Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, and you find that it says this. If a man marries a man who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent, my italics, about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. The debate that raged amongst the Pharisees, not all Pharisees believed the same things. There were right-wing ones and left-wing ones. There were conservative ones and more liberal ones. And there were two very influential schools of rabbis in Jesus' day, and they didn't like one another. And they come to Jesus together and they say, is it right for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? In Jesus' time and context, that was a legal phrase, and we know that now because of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we've discovered. You see, archaeology informs our understanding of the Bible. Any and every reason was a big debate in Jesus' society. There were some Pharisees and teachers of the Jewish law who said, you can divorce your wife for any and every reason. She burns the meal, she's not looking good, she's past her best, she's put on a bit of weight, whatever. Get rid of her. Any and every reason, divorce. And there were some, the more conservatives, who said, no, any and every reason must talk about some lewd sexual reason. It's just about a sexual reason. It was never about adultery, actually, because the Old Testament was clear. Adultery justified stoning, justified execution. So everybody argued about what any and every reason meant. And that's what Jesus is talking about. What do you know about Jesus? You know that he's for the dignity of every person. Love everyone, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, serve, give yourself. So this is what Jesus says to those who are looking to divorce their wives for any and every reason. He says, haven't you heard? In the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said to them, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So there no longer be two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God's joined together, don't separate. Work for community. Trust one another. Now, Jesus goes on to say there are some times when divorce happens, and Paul declares the same. Sometimes relationships break down, but work at what is good. So that's it, really. That's all the New Testament says on this issue. And can you see what it's about time and time again? Don't exploit. Don't abuse. Live together in harmony, include work-at relationships. What does the New Testament say about same-sex relationships? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. What does it say about exploitative sex, whoever is involved? A lot. Promiscuity, casual sex, sleeping around, using and abusing another person for your own interest is always wrong. And that's a message that needs to be heard by the heterosexual community inside our churches, as well as the homosexual community and others. It's harder, I believe, in our churches today for someone to come out as a gay person than it is for a Christian to come out as a Christian in society. It's really hard to stand up sometimes and say, I'm a follower of Jesus, isn't it? I believe that the church has made it harder for gay people to stand up and say, I'm gay, than any of that. We celebrate when when two heterosexuals get married. We congratulate them, we send them cards, we send them on marriage courses, we support them, we embrace them, it's joyous. I believe in same-sex marriage because I believe in marriage. I'm not for promiscuity. I'm not for relationships that aren't committed. I'm for relationships that are lifelong and enduring and lasting and faithful. And the church needs to create a legitimate place where LGBT and T people can enjoy that privilege and that stability. And I think that is clearly the message of the whole of the Bible and of Jesus. Thank you.